KPBS On Demand is supported by Fleet Science Center's newest exhibit, Survival of the Slowest. See firsthand how nature's smallest, slowest, and weakest creatures can not only survive, but thrive in the wild. Open May 24th through September 1st. Learn more at fleetscience.org.
Welcome back to another edition of the KPBS Cinema Junkie podcast. I'm Beth Accomando. Today we're going to talk all about Latin cinema, and especially the films that push boundaries and go someplace dark. The reason to focus on Latin cinema right now is that the 23rd Annual San Diego Latino Film Festival kicks off on March 10th and runs through March 20th. One of the sidebars this year is called Mundo Extraño, or The Strange World. So I'll be speaking with Miguel Rodriguez, who in addition to programming Horrible Imaginings Film Festival in the fall, is the programmer for Mundo Extraño. So Miguel, welcome to the show again. You've been on before.
I have, and it's always good to be back. Thank you.
And let's start off for people. The Mundo Extraño sidebar at the Latino Film Festival has been running for a few years, but what is your definition of a film that would fit into this category?
So my personal definition is any film that comes at their material from a very unique or fantastical perspective. One way I like to think of these is films that are pure cinema. And what I mean by pure cinema is that the events that unfold on screen are vastly removed from what we would see in reality. So I'm looking for some things with a little bit more of a fantasy bend. It could be dark, but something hyper real, I think, is really what I really want to look for, because I'm looking for things that are metaphorical, that represent what the filmmaker's trying to say with these higher concepts.
So in terms of picking these films, it's less maybe about content and more about stylistic approach?
That is a huge part of it. The stylistic approach and the content are kind of married in a way that it's hard to separate them. And this is something that has been mastered by filmmakers like Jesus Franco or David Lynch, where you can't have the content without the bizarre and surreal ways that those concepts are being presented. Presentation is a huge part of what we're looking for.
So maybe you can cite a couple of examples from past programs that really typify this particular quality that you're looking for.
Oh, certainly. So last year there was a film called, from Argentina, I believe, by a director named Emiliano Romero, and that film was called Topos, which means moles. And it is kind of a post-apocalyptic story, almost like Brave New World, where the class strata has separated such that the rich people still live on the surface of the planet, where the poor people all live underground as topos, as moles, and they're all, filthy, and they walk hunched over, and they have, kind of lurid and disgusting lives. And one of them wants to escape, and he ends up kidnapping someone from the surface and taking that person's place. And the person who he kidnapped was going into a ballet school. So the rest of the film is this mole, is this underdweller who spends the rest of the film in a ballet school. And it's wonderfully bizarre, yet it also says a lot about, class, the differences in class and the widening gap between rich and poor, but in a brilliantly fantastical way. And then before that, there was another film called Las Mariposas de Sidorní, or Sidorní's Butterflies. But it's another one that's just as fantastical. The lead character is a circus dwarf who was jailed for murder and ended up, the story takes place after he is released and him trying to get on with his life again. And it's just shot in this otherworldly way, in these different hues. So the color is monochromatic at times, but in very interesting and fascinating ways. And both of those stories say a lot about the culture in which they were made, but they're also very hyper-real. They're not at all what we would say, cinema verite or something that is very realistic.
So this year for Un Mundo Extraño, there's actually one film that might be a little more accessible to a mainstream audience because it stars someone that people are probably very familiar with, which is Salma Hayek, and this is Tale of Tales.
Every new life calls for a life to be lost. The equilibrium of the world must be maintained. Are you willing to accept the risk?
I am prepared to die in order to feel life grow inside me.
Hunt a sea monster. Cut out its heart. You will become pregnant.
This is an anthology film. What is this one like?
So this one's an interesting film for Latino Film Festival. Salma Hayek, of course, is our big star, so especially for the Latino audiences, so this should be a big draw. This one is a co-production of Italy, France, and the UK, but it's a collection or an anthology of fairy tales. So some of them are pretty dark, some of them have monsters, but they're very fantastical fairy tales, and they're kind of like the morality tales of old. So this one certainly is going to be, as you say, much more accessible to the regular audiences at San Diego Latino Film Festival, and what I hope will be audiences who might try the festival for the first time. So I'm hoping that a title like Tale of Tales, especially in this age where fantasies, and I do include things like superhero epics and fantasy, are very well attended and popular with regular audiences. I hope Tale of Tales will reach out to broader Latino Film Festival and bring people to the festival for the first time.
You mentioned that this actually does not have Mexican producers or Latino production companies behind it. It's Italian, French, and British, which raises some interesting questions about Latin cinema. You were talking about how this is showing how Latin cinema is kind of entering a different international stage at this point.
Yeah, I think they're all based on Giambattista Basile's fairy tales, which again, might even make it more strange. I think that the Latino culture from all over the world is becoming more recognized on the world stage as an arts and culture powerhouse. So whether it's music or dance or film or regular art, we're seeing some of these ideas represented from the perspectives of other cultures, which I think is one of those things that's an indicator that you've kind of made it, where if your culture is recognized or, dare I say, imitated by another culture, then there's something there that shows that you have some kind of staying power, that you have something that people want to see. For example, in the 60s, everyone wanted to be Italy. So you wanted everyone making La Dolce Vita from different countries. So I'm hoping to see something like that now for Latino film and Latino culture, and I think that Tale of Tales might be an example of that, because there's definitely a Latin flavor, not only to how the stories are told and what some of these fairy tales are, but definitely the way they look and the things people wear. And, of course, using Salma Hayek as one of your main actors, too, says a lot.
So there's another film playing at the festival called Eisenstein in Guanajuato, which is from Peter Greenaway, which is a British filmmaker making a film about a Russian filmmaker, Sergei Eisenstein, who visits Mexico with all these kind of preconceptions about what Mexico is. And so again, especially in this year where we've had the Academy Awards being called out for a lack of diversity and a focus on how minorities are depicted in film. So you get this very interesting kind of once removed quality to some of these films. But these are much more positive reflections on these cultures and looking to these cultures from the outside, but not looking to them in quite the stereotypical way that we've seen in the past.
I came to Mexico to make a movie. I came to Mexico because my very first theater production in Moscow was called The Mexican. I came to Mexico because you had a successful revolution 5 years before we did. I came to Guanajuato because you have here a museum of the dead. Maybe I have to make a film called Museum of the Living. Those are my excuses. What are your excuses?
I live here. I have a family here. I teach in Mexico City and I teach here.
And what do you teach?
I studied as an anthropologist. And now, I teach comparative religion.
This is a Roman Catholic country. How come you're allowed to talk about other religions?
Roman Catholicism of Mexico is generous and all-embracing. Pantheistic. A bit of everything, old and new. They just take what they need. So much so we should call it Mexican Catholicism. They customized it. We have pre-Columbian equivalents for everything the Roman Catholics dreamed of.
Certainly, we invented blood sacrifices before you did.
Christianity adopted us. We did not adopt Christianity.
That particular film sounds interesting because you have a British director looking at Mexican culture through Russian goggles. And I think those layers could serve to a multi-purpose where you not only have the depiction of Mexico from the perspective of these other cultures, but you also have the possibility, the very real possibility of a common thread running through all of them. And that's something that I think film in particular, the art of cinema, has a real monopoly on, is the ability to start conversations, but also to grow empathy in an audience for people who are not of their culture. And I think, one of the reasons that a lot of people want to see more diversity in Hollywood is for that reason, is to build an empathetic response in the majority of people for someone who might not look like them, as well as, of course, getting representation, but and getting different stories told. But I think that this particular film is an interesting way to have us try to understand one another. And I think that everyone should go see it. It's also really great that that's a film picked for the Latino Film Festival. You would not really expect it because it's not made by a Latino filmmaker, and it's not about a Latino. I mean, it's a film not made by a Latino filmmaker about a filmmaker who wasn't a Latino, but it's about their experiences in a Latino country. That's something that I think it could be enriching for an audience.
Yeah, it's a great film, and it's interesting too because the Mexican characters who are in it are definitely kind of the wiser guides taking this kind of wacky Russian filmmaker through different experiences. And so, whereas in the past, I think we've seen Mexican characters depicted in a very stereotypical kind of comic light. I mean, this guy is elegant looking, he's smart. Eisenstein comes in going like, I admire you people so much. You had your revolution before ours. And so it's a really interesting film for a Latino film festival. So I hope people go see it. But let's get to some of the slightly darker films that you've chosen as part of this year's Un Mundo Extraño. Let's start with one where music plays a key part, in particular piano music. So let's hear a little bit of the music that colors Scherzo Diabolico. Tell us about this film, because the character we initially meet who's listening to this music looks a little mousy and timid, and that is total false advertising.
Yeah. Now that you mention it, this seems to be a hallmark of the director. So the director of Scherzo Diabolico is this Spanish-born filmmaker named Adrián García Bogliano. And he's made his mark on a couple of films. He made a film called Here Comes the Devil, and he made an English language film recently that anyone could see on Netflix called Late Phases. It's a werewolf movie. And now Scherzo Diabolico. And I think one thing that runs through all of them is their lead characters start out one way and then end up a way that defies expectation. Like, for example, the lead character in Late Phases is blind, and he ends up going against werewolves. And so, yeah, that's an interesting thought. I think that Bogliano likes to take these characters to places that an audience wouldn't expect, for good or ill, you know. And in the case of Scherzo Diabolico, this particular character who's an accountant, you're right, mousy, has a nagging wife, all of those types of characteristics. He ends up going against type in a way that might not be, advisable.
And we won't reveal anymore because part of the, I'm not sure I can say pleasure exactly, but part of what makes this film so good is that a couple of characters actually surprise you in terms of the choices that they make. Now, one that's a little more claustrophobic and tense is what you've called a kind of a David Lynchian film, which is Plan Sexenal.
Plan Sexenal, I believe this is the director's first debut film, Santiago Candejas. Yeah, David Lynch is a good benchmark for what people can expect from this in the soundscape, the way things are presented, the way they're shot. Maybe Lost Highway would be a good example of a way to compare Plan Sexenal. I would also compare it to Heineke's Funny Games in that it takes place in suburbia. So actually, you could also compare this to Blue Velvet then in that case. But it's all about the place that's supposed to be safe and what might be lurking in the dark out there. You've got your suburban couple, and they end up being visited by a stranger, and things get very dark, but also very bizarre. So it takes you on this ride through the darkest parts of the human nature, but in ways that are, again, hyper real and removed from something getting a little. I guess one thing you could say about Heineke's Funny Games is it's very real. It's the opposite of something hyper-real. This is more Lynchian in that it's surreal.
And there's a sense of paranoia that runs through your final choice, which is Los Parecidos. And this all takes place at a bus station?
Yeah, so Los Parecidos is directed by Isaac Esban, who I think once again, the fantasy element here, it might be a hallmark of this director. Last year, he came to the Latino Film Festival with a film called El Incidente, which was pretty popular. I remember both screenings I went to for that were full. And that one was all about this warp in space and time and people trapped in like 1 second for eternity or something very strange like that. And in Los Parecidos, you have a group of strangers. They're waiting at a bus stop. I think it's twilight, 2 a.m. or something. Without giving too much away, the fantastic things start happening, and it creates a sense of paranoia, growing distrust among these strangers for each other. They lose their sense of identity, which is a big part of a lot of Mexican or Latino horror in general. They fight amongst themselves and things like that. So it's, again, very bizarre. A lot is unexplained as to why this is happening. But it speaks to fears, I think, we all share, but are also somewhat specific to Mexico. They're somewhat specific to the Latino culture in which they were born. This idea of loss of identity, for example, and not knowing where you are and where you're going and when you're going to get there and how you're going to get there. And this idea of also living amongst your peers and not being able to trust them. Just on the ride here to do this interview, I was listening to KPBS Midday Edition, and Maureen was talking to a reporter from Mexico City about all of the reporters and journalists from Mexico who are being disappeared because of cartels and drug violence, and how that in the U.S. that's not in the news as much as it was, but it's still very real fear, and it's something that that people are living with. And the reporter described it as being in quicksand. she's a reporter and she's talking to government officials and she doesn't know whether to believe a word they're saying and whether they're getting paid by the cartels and human trafficking and bringing all of these terrifying things into it. Hearing her talk, I was thinking of Los Parecidos because it's that same kind of unknown danger lurking all around you that you feel in this film. Only it's one setting over one night at a bus stop, but the emotions that are being expressed are the same. So I that's one thing I like about programming for Un Mundo Extraño and for Latino Film Festival is that although I see lots of horror and genre stuff for Horrible Imaginings, that's from all over the world, with focusing on the genre output from one culture or one group of people, you start to see lines of commonality, of things that are particular to that culture, and I think that's fascinating because people think of horror as something very simple or something very simplistic, but if you really get down to brass tacks and examine it and look at surveys of genre stuff from different cultures and different countries, then you start to see these flavors appear, and I think that's just wonderful.
So put these films into a bit of a context then. Are they representative of what is happening in Latin cinema? Do they represent a particular wave of Latin cinema, or are these kind of oddball entries?
I think that for sure we're getting more Latin genre films coming out. Way more filmmakers willing to take risks. We've got film festivals that are huge, that are strictly horror in Mexico, in Spain, of course. You've got Sitges and things like that. In Argentina and Brazil, you've got lots of horror coming out. And I think we're seeing a lot more. I mean, certainly the films I get to Horrible Imaginings and to something like this are growing in number and also growing in variety. So we're different people taking different risks. For sure, in Spain, they've got a lot of government subsidies, but a lot of that is going to genre stuff. So there is a need, I think, from some Latino countries to explore these ideas. And I think that's in no small part due to things like being in a highly Catholic culture or being, in Mexico's case, and all three of the films we've talked about today, other than Tale of Tales, but the last three are all Mexican films. You've got some uncertainty in that country that drives this kind of narrative. And I think that this is a cathartic thing for a storyteller to offer. So
you mentioned Catholicism. Is that part of what gives these films a unique flavor?
Depends on the film, but often often by default from a Latino film, you'll have some kind of Catholic iconography somewhere in there, whether it's just set dressing. It doesn't have to be central to the narrative. But if there's a crucifix, and we're talking about a Mexican crucifix here, if there's a crucifix on the wall, then that lends the atmosphere of flavor that you might not get from an American horror film.
Well, you mentioned a Mexican crucifix. Now, some people may not understand what the difference is between walking into a Catholic church in the United States and walking into a Catholic church in Mexico, which depicts the crucifixion in a very different sort of manner. So how would you define that?
A crucifix that you'll see typically in the United States will generally be, I'll use the word minimalistic to use an art term. It'll be, or sanitized, you could say, where it'll probably just be two crossbeams. Maybe there will be a figure of Christ on the crucifix, but many times not. In Mexico, it will be much more. It'll be much less sanitized. The pain and suffering that is inherent to the crucifix, inherent to the passion of Christ, is on full display typically in Mexican churches. There's blood, There's a very gaunt and a Christ who is definitely, obviously suffering for us, suffering for our sins. And I think that is a huge part of what drives the iconography that appears in these films and the atmosphere of some of these films, because the fear and suffering and the darkness of what Christ experienced in that episode is something that they're not shying away from as much as we seem to be. So it's maybe you could say it's a little more honest, but at the same time, it certainly lends itself to the imagery that would be in a horror film. And I can tell you, growing up Mexican, especially as a young kid, very close to the Mexican border in South Texas, you got lots of imagery like that, and it was scary. As a kid, I was scared. So
that Old Testament is scary. I am not Mexican, but I grew up Catholic, and I remember being.
Well, you've got the Italians.
Yeah, I've got the Italians and the
thing.
French, and being read some of those stories I remember from the Old Testament. And this comes in to play a little bit in the Scherzo Diabolico. This Old Testament sense of an eye for an eye,
the revenge,
comes into play at the end in a way that is absolutely ruthless. And I mean, that's what I was thinking of, it very Old Testament kind of, even though that's not up front, as like the film does not play as kind of.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't have to be explicit. It just has to be a shared ideal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll never forget seeing, as long as we're on the subject of film, seeing Scorsese's Last Temptation of Christ for the first time, and how perplexed poor Judas is at the mixed messages he's receiving from Jesus in that film. I saw that when I was very young, and my father was very Catholic. He was a priest before he met my mom. So I had lots of stories about Jesus in my child rearing days, but getting that view of I remember Harvey Keitel as Judas appealing to him. Was like, what do you want, man? You tell us to use the axe, now you're telling us to turn the other cheek. We don't understand what's going on here. And I think it's that the two different messages you get from the Old Testament vengeful God and then what you get later on with the New Testament. It's the same kind of thing. They're very different, very different fables written at very different times, and it can be very confusing. That's what makes it interesting. And it also makes it just beautiful. It's a feast for anyone who wants to make a film about terror. Because fear is a huge part of the Catholic tradition. Whoever wants to believe that or not, it's true. The words fear of God are spoken, and that's what horror is, really. It's just, okay, I feel this, I want to express it, I need to get this out somehow. And so that's just a wealth of fear that you can. And that's why you have movies like The Exorcist that did so well for that reason.
Well,
One thing, go ahead.
Oh, and I was just going to say, if people want to get kind of an entry to this on an accessible level, Guillermo del Toro is a perfect director to provide that with his early films. Cronus, which presents the vampire as kind of a Christ reborn figure, and then later films like The Devil's Backbone, and even in his mainstream Hollywood films like Hellboy, you get a bit of that Catholicism running through, and you can see how it colors his perspective on horror and on depicting some of these things. Yeah,
Del Toro is an interesting director to bring up because he has said himself that he doesn't fit in anywhere. He doesn't fit in Hollywood. He doesn't fit in horror. He doesn't fit in indie. He's kind of like this, and he relates that to being Mexican. He's like, I don't fit in with these gringos, and I don't really fit in with the Mexicans anymore. I'm kind of in this nebulous purgatory as an artist and as a person, and well, that goes back to what I was saying with Los Perecidos. It's this identity loss that is a genuine fear, and that can be depicted in a lot of ways, but it can be depicted in horror too, in things like Los Perecidos, and if you want to go something not Latin, in films like Polanski's The Tenant, where loss of identity is a genuine terror. I think that is a particular fear that a minority audience and a minority group of artists and filmmakers can understand, and I think that's why at a film festival like the Latino Film Festival or the Asian Film Festival or Film Out, the LGBT Film Festival, you get a lot of films that is kind of the central concept. I don't belong there. I don't belong here. I have no identity. Where do I belong? There's a lot of films like that. What I like to see with a sidebar like Un Mundo Extraño is it can take that same concept but present it in a different way. Because if you see lots of those kinds of films, they all start to kind of blend together. And they can also be alienating, I think, to an audience, in this case, who's not Latino. So I love that Latino is going to have an Un Mundo Extraño because I'd like to appeal to someone who's not Latino. I'd like to give them an access point to come to the Latino Film Festival. I've talked to people who feel like, that film festival is not for me. I wouldn't feel comfortable going to the Latino Film Festival. I'm not Latino. I think that's a real thing. But if we have something like, Tale of Tales or Scherzo Diabolico, which has granted a very Latin-flavored horror, but a very familiar horror as well, then maybe that will get the attention of someone who would come to Latino Film Festival, an access point into something different that they're not used to. Or they'll see a trailer for like the film you were talking about, Eisenstein in Guanajuato, and say, you know what, I think I'll check that out too. And then they'll come back next year and suddenly they'll have this wealth of culture in front of them that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And horror can be that, because it is a populist genre, it can be that welcoming entry point for people, which I know is kind of funny because it seems like it would be a way to scare you off. But I'm hoping it will do the opposite.
Well, I think genre filmmaking in general is a great way to enter into foreign films because for so long, people were hesitant to go to anything that had subtitles. Mm-hmm. But what broke through that, I think, most effectively were action films. Mm-hmm. So we had Jackie Chan in the 90s, and we also had this French film, The Brotherhood of the Wolf, which were action films. So even if you weren't interested in reading those subtitles, you at least got 30 or 40 minutes of action that you could watch and consume without any problems with translation. And I think that made a leap for people because it wasn't as hard to sell films like Hero and House of the Flying Dagger and Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon because people had kind of gotten like, oh, okay, reading subtitles doesn't have to be a painful thing.
Right. And I think I remember almost the shift when it went from dubbed to, okay, let's try subtitles. Because Rumble in the Bronx was dubbed and Police Story was dubbed. But then you started getting some film. The subtitled films started doing well.
Yep.
When some of the Japanese horror stuff started coming up too. So then in the 2000s as well. You're right. I think that genre and horror particularly is a great entry point not only into foreign film but also into older film, classic film too, where the same could be said for getting someone to watch a black and white film. With drama and comedy, fewer people are willing. The people who are reluctant to see black and white films, if that's their wheelhouse, then they'll just watch movies that started in the 1980s and on. But the horror people will flock to Nosferatu and Dracula and Island of Lost Souls and some of the classics. So I think that you're right. I think this is a great genre for bringing people into the fold.
Well, I hope people go and check out some of the films in Mundo Extraño and use that as a gateway drug to some more films. But I want to kind of broaden the discussion from not just these 4 films that you're showing this year, but to talk a little bit about some of Latin cinema that does push boundaries and is a little different, but also something accessible. So first of all, I want to talk about the films that got you first into Mexican cinema, and especially people may be familiar with the term El Santo. They may not know exactly what it is, but Mexican wrestling films are huge and to an American audience probably feel somewhat foreign, but they are on a certain level very accessible. And this was one of the things that got you into Mexican cinema.
Oh, the Santo films were huge. Yeah. All of those enmascaderos films or masked luchador wrestler films. But Santo is like James Bond and Batman rolled into one.
Gana el Santo la primera caída. Pero qué facilidad del Santo para llevarse esta caída. Público lo ovaciona. Una ovación muy merecida.
The Santo films are very strange, and there are like almost 60 of them. So how prolific they are, that says something about it too. You know, it is something that for a time would seem so particularly and peculiarly Mexican. It was hard to think that would sell well in the States. There was one guy, K. Gordon Murray, in the 60s, who brought over a lot of Mexican horror into the States. And that's why we have English translations of a lot of Santo films and of other even stranger films that came out at the time. But with Santo, you get so many different kinds. For the most part, you could say that they are superhero spy movies with a masked wrestler is James Bond. He drives fancy cars. He's got pretty ladies. He wears the mask everywhere, even to the bank. But you'll also have movies they'll have monsters and ghosts and ninjas and robots and whatever Santo happens to be fighting in that film. So horror and the creature feature is also ingrained into Santo. I mean, one of the greatest, of course, is Santo y Blue Demon contra los monstruos, which is Santo and his buddy Blue Demon against like every of the classic monsters, like Dracula and the Frankenstein's monster and the Mummy, and they're so fun. And growing up as a monster fanatic, you couldn't beat that. You've got Dracula wrestling with Santo. It's completely bizarre, but there's nothing else like it. So yeah, that was a big part of my growing up experience.
And El Santo is a very Mexican standard in Mexican cinema. I mean, and he had a persona off screen as well. I mean, you talk about how he would wear his mask all the time within the context of the film, but you're also talking about outside the film as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't see him without the mask ever. That would be criminal.
You bring up El Santo versus the monsters, but Mexico has a history of early monster films. My entry to this was a film called Ship of Monsters, and I had the pleasure of talking with its star, Lorena Velázquez, at the San Diego Latino Film Festival a few years ago. So I want to let her describe what this movie was about, because it's this fantastical, charming mix of genres. So here's Lorena Velázquez talking about Ship of Monsters from 1960.
This is a beautiful picture. This is the history of a man, a norteño man in Mexico, that he's a big liar. He find us, and he find the spaceship, and he came immediately to the bar, and he said, "Listen, now this is the truth. I saw a woman from another planet, and I saw the spaceship, and now you have to believe me. This is the truth. I saw them." And they say, "Come on, you are a liar." And in that spaceship comes a monsters.
Was it fun to shoot with these creatures?
Well, because yes, I have to kiss one of them. And this is a real experience, let me tell you. Because they was with I don't know what they have in the mouth and here, but here they look like they are swearing, and they have here something in the mouth that when I kiss him, oh my God, I said, what I'm doing? But I was so young that I said maybe it's water or something like that. No. But looks like jello, like like jelly or something. No, this is a big experience. But let me tell you, in Mexico, it's a classic film. And it's beautiful. It's really, everything is like a comedy, no? This is not a tragedy. This is you have to be laughing, no? All the time, and at least we did it. And this is almost 40 years, 50 years. So you have to see the picture and you have to see. And in Mexico, we don't have all the money that the Americans have. No, there's a little bit cheaper. The pictures.
Una estrella del deseo. Hay que hacer una petición pedida. Tráeme una muchacha bonita, pero que me creya. Que me creya.
The thing about that film is it was such a wild mix. There's a singing cowboy, there's, women, space aliens from Venus that are in these hot bathing suit outfits, and then there's all these strange monsters at the end, and it has this wonderful kind of naivete to it where we can make props out of cardboard and boxes, and it's a little bit of the Ed Wood Plan 9 from Outer Space, but with a lot more kind of charm to it and innocence. So I don't know how you see that fitting into this kind of Un Mundo Extraño world.
It's the definition of Un Mundo Extraño because everything in it is strange. But basically, it's an everything but the kitchen sink movie because, as you mentioned, of all the elements that it incorporates, it's basically all the most popular Mexican genres at the time. The singing cowboy, that was very popular, is cowboy musicals. The norteño cowboy musicals, so they throw it into Ship of Monsters. The space lady phenomenon is not just Mexico. That was everywhere in the 60s. Of course you're going to throw that in too. The monsters themselves are what makes them so lovable is not only that they were made on shoestring, and obviously so, but there's so much imagination that goes into them. Every monster, there's a variety of sizes. Some are really big, some are really small. They all have these bizarre features. One has a big head with a big brain and big eyes, and there's such a variety of monsters. And if you love monsters, they're all there. And in fact, some of those monsters in Ship of Monsters show up in some of the Santo films later on. So they get extra mileage out of those monster suits. But yeah, anyone who loves a person in a monster suit movie, then that movie is made for you. You need to see Ship of Monsters immediately. I always think of John Landis because John Landis is one of those voices we have, and he's like, any movie can be made better with a man in a gorilla suit. And it doesn't. It could be any suit for me, but I know what he means.
I believe that was the year that they also had brought back one of the Mexican vampire films.
El vampiro. De entre las brumas que amparan la escalofriante leyenda de hombres que jamás murieron como Nostradamus, Cagliostro y el conde Drácula, surge de pronto la amenaza extraña de un hombre muerto que vuelve a la vida cada noche, al conjuro de aterrador destino, en busca de víctimas a quienes beber su sangre. El vampiro.
Permiso.
Well, Germán Robles, we could say, is Mexico's Christopher Lee. So, yeah, absolutely. You could say he's like Bela Lugosi or Christopher Lee. He's the Dracula with the long black cape and the medallion and all of that. I would say, yeah, he's probably more in line with Hammer and Christopher Lee because in Mexico they could be a little more risque. They could show his fangs. Bella had no fangs, some people forget. He's just got this great presence. One thing about Germán Robles is he wasn't Mexican. He was actually Spanish-born, but did move to Mexico and had his whole career in Mexico and became a huge star with some of these films. The first one, or one of his first, being El Vampiro, the vampire, where essentially he's playing a Dracula-type character. It's not really Dracula per se, but the story is very familiar and it's timeless, so it would appeal to people. And it was so popular, he ended up reprising that a couple of times and playing some other monsters on top of that. So, and including, I believe, Nostradamus and some other crazy characters. So he was a character actor for the ages, and I hope that his name becomes more recognized for American audiences because he did contribute a lot to Mexican cinema. He just died this past November, so this is a good time to remember him.
The films we've been talking about, the El Santo films, these monster films, the vampire films, they all have a certain charm to them and almost a sweetness to them and a sense of nostalgia. But Mexican cinema more recently has ventured into some much more extreme territory. Mm-hmm. Do you see a lineage coming from this to the current cinema? And what kind of films are you seeing now getting submitted for your festival?
Well, this past year we played an anthology Mexican film called México Bárbaro. Barbaric Mexico, so take that title for what you will, but certainly more extreme. I think that the lineage is mirrored by the lineage we'd see in the States. We had our Bellas, which led to our Hitchcocks, which eventually leads to Texas Chainsaw Massacre and some of the other stuff we had, and so you have the same kind of lineage there. Mexico is a slightly different story in that its film industry has a very interesting history. So while it used to have a film industry that was close to the United States in that it started out with this kind of studio-esque feel, it ended up getting funded very much by the government until the late 70s, early 80s, when that money just dried up. And for a long time in Mexico, you had the entire film industry was basically composed of independent guerrilla exploitation filmmakers making, Mad Max ripoffs with punks on motorcycles, like Intrépidos Punks, for example. You had horror movies, you had some anthologies, you had bizarre ghost stories and Satanist stories, and you just had this wild gamut where these people were getting money however they could to make their movies. And because of that, were doing whatever they wanted. So that culture of the independent spirit, the exploitation video market that exploded in Mexico in the late 80s with an imprint called Video Home helped to breed our current era of filmmakers. So our latest filmmakers, like I think you're going to talk to Aaron, or you have in the past talked to Aaron Soto, or Lex Ortega, or Adrian Bogliano, or some of these other independent filmmakers that are not afraid of going a little bit too crazy because they grew up on movies like Intrépidos Punks and as well as Return of the Living Dead and things like that. So, seeing things like México Bárbaro. I'm forgetting the name of Lex Ortega's latest film, but it's also very kind of extreme. You've got the Morbido Film Festival in Mexico City, which is gets government funding, and you see posters for it all over. I remember I was talking to Mauricio Chernovetsky. He went to that. And there's posters for it on the subways. It's huge. Thousands of people are going to this thing. So there's definitely a thirst for something that pushes the boundaries more. And I think that's just natural. I mean, you always want to top what came before it, right? So I think that's what they're in those stages now. I think we'll always have that.
And do you see anything in common with kind of this latest wave of extreme filmmaking coming from Mexico?
I think what I see most in common is that a lot of the filmmakers are still quite young and have a rebelliousness about them. They want their films to be subversive. That's a huge part of it. I think one of the two big heroes of Latino cinema is, well, one, of course, Alejandro Jodorowsky, who has his own bizarre history, but certainly a big hero of surreal and very subversive films. Juan López Moctezuma, who made Alucarda, is also very much looked up to by this new generation of Mexican filmmakers. And one thing about that filmmaker, Moctezuma, is that for example, Alucarda, which tends to get grouped in a subsection of exploitation films called nunsploitation.
Alucarda, God the Father commands thee. God the Son commands thee. God the Holy Ghost commands thee. No! Con Claudio Brook.
Is actually a really politically sound film about the Catholic Church, but it's but it's put, it's presented in that film with a cloister of nuns who practice in this dungeon with crazy artwork on the walls, and there's sex and there's Satan and there's all this crazy stuff. But that film is not just about shocking people. That film is basically rage on screen. It's someone expressing their anger at this system and their frustration with all the promises that are made by religion that you don't feel like they're being kept because of whatever's going on in your country at that time, whatever political strife is going on, whatever poverty is happening. These artists want to express their disappointment and dissatisfaction with all the promises made by that. And I think that Alucarda is one of those potent examples of that. And it speaks to this generation of filmmakers. I think they want to make a film like that. And certainly for the time that was made, that was a jaw-dropping film. And I think we want to see more of those.
Okay, well, we're kind of coming full circle back around because both Jodorowsky and him are both railing against the Catholic Church.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if this sense of rebellion, because the Catholic Church, again, this also ties into Turner Classic Movies is doing a current program called Condemned as their spotlight program for March, which is all about the American or films in America that were condemned by the Catholic Church and the Catholic Legion of Decency. So in America, in the early part, and especially in the 30s and 40s and early 50s, the Catholic Church had a very strong impact on the kind of things that Hollywood films could show. In Mexico, the Catholic Church also has, and still has to a degree, a strong censoring impact on films. So as part of what these young filmmakers are rebelling against is this kind of repression that you get in part from the Catholic Church?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I think there's without question there. I think anytime you have repression, you're going to have a backlash to it, especially from the arts community, because the artistic mind cannot abide repression like that, I don't think. I think that's part, you can't be silenced when all you need to do, when all you want to do, all you're driven to do is shout on the mountain. So yeah, I think repression's a part of it. The same could be said in Japan, where you have a lot of wild cinema that comes from a very repressive society. So
not Catholicism.
Not Catholicism, but repression.
But repression, yes.
Yeah,
politeness.
repression of a very different kind,
yeah.
But certainly repression. With the Catholic Legion of Decency in the States, they had a studio system to battle. And in Mexico for so long, you didn't. Who was a censor going to fight for intrepidos punks? Like, it's just some guy with a camera running around on the highway. And I think that that DIY aspect of flying under the radar is something that these newer groups of filmmakers, both America, anywhere from really, are trying to cling on to for that reason, because when you don't have to answer to producers or to studios, then typically you don't have to answer to censors either. These independent filmmakers aren't going to the MPAA. I think you get the same kinds of things from something like Mexico Barbaro, where we'll make it ourselves and we'll put it out ourselves, and then it won't get censored.
Arturo Ripstein is a filmmaker in Mexico who also happens to be Jewish. He has a new film this year, which is always an exciting thing. This year it's called Bleak Street and is definitely one of the films worth checking out at the Latino Film Festival. But he has had a long history of making films in Mexico and dealing with censors. He's made a lot of films critical of the Catholic Church. And I remember talking to him about possibly making films in the United States or outside of Mexico where he might not face this kind of censorship. And part of his feeling was it was the repression and the censorship that made him the particular filmmaker he was. And I think the thing he pointed out was some Turkish filmmaker who had made some wonderful film in Turkey under a repressive government, who then went to France to make a film and then committed suicide. And his point was something like, you kind of need something to bang your head against the wall to help get those creative juices going.
This is that great dichotomy. I've had this conversation a ton. One of my favorite ways this was put is my friend Keith Allison, who writes a blog called Teleport City. He was reviewing I think it was Life Force of all movies. But he said, if I ever have kids, I'm going to be torn between letting them watch these movies or banning them from watching these movies so they could get the joy out of going behind my back and watching them anyway, which is how we all watched these kinds of things for a time. You're right. There's a certain... your soul gets kickstarted when someone's telling you no. Another element to this is that whole video nasty thing that happened in the 80s in the UK, where Mary Woodhouse and a bunch of other parliament types and censors in the United Kingdom banned this whole hundreds of films from being sold in the UK. And so video stores were owners were getting arrested because they had a VHS on their shelf. It was crazy. But all that ended up happening. Here we are in 2016, and all that the video nasty thing did was make those films still remembered now. Because I guarantee you, like Night of the Bloody Apes would be completely forgotten if it wasn't a video nasty. You know what I mean? And the same could be said for a lot of those movies. They were all, some were okay, some were good, but a lot of them were just crap and would have faded away into the ether, except they were banned, except they were video nasties. So now they're on all these video nasties lists, and now they have Blu-ray editions and all this stuff. And it's like, I could just see Mary Woodhouse turning in her grave because it's her fault that those movies are so prevalent now. The movies she was trying to suppress.
And again, the TCM program condemned a lot of these films we might not be talking about if they hadn't been condemned. And some of these films were the ones... Not the early ones. I think a lot of people were following what the Catholic Church was dictating. But as you moved on, a lot of those films became much more attractive. And more recently, condemning something like Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ.
That would be one.
I remember crossing picket lines to go see it at the Fashion Valley Theater and being in line with teenagers who would never go to a religious movie. They would not go see the Ten Commandments, but they were like, ooh, this is a forbidden film. I'm going to go see a film about Christ. And it is ultimately a very religious film. Scorsese is very serious about...
That film is not anti-Catholicism.
No.
At all.
Except for a few people in the Catholic Church.
Except, because... they want to have this ultra clean perfection of their ideals when, I think actually this ties back to who's the nun who's introducing these condemned films?
Oh, Sister Rose.
Sister Rose. When she's talking about, it was Black Narcissus. She made this great line about, she quoted
it was a Catholic newspaper. I think you're talking about, she quotes a Catholic newspaper where they say something about the nuns and how, like, they're crazy and they're insane and neurotic.
And nuns would not be like this because they are driven by their faith or whatever. And yeah, her response was, this person obviously didn't know any nuns.
Well, and specifically, she goes, that was obviously written by a man who knows nothing about what nuns go through.
Yeah.
And if the Catholic,
that was perfect.
If the Catholic Church was smarter, I mean, Black Narcissus is a perfect example of a film where they condemned it kind of on a very narrow focus of, well, it depicts the Catholic Church in a way that we don't want to see it. But ignoring a bigger picture, which is it's depicting people within the Catholic Church as human beings.
Yeah, and that was the problem that they had with Last Temptation of Christ.
Yes.
All that did was depict Jesus as a human being with human being feelings, and that threw people in an uproar.
Yes, I do have memory of my
film,
very Catholic grandmother, who is the source of the Catholicism in our family. But she would go and wag her finger at the nuns at the Catholic Church, telling them how dare they ban Last Temptation of Christ. Everyone should go see it. Yeah. So that's the kind of Catholicism I was brought up in, which was very confusing.
Yeah,
I had an agnostic father read me from the Bible because he thought it was a beautiful piece of literature. So I was very confused.
Yeah.
But it had a very
you figure it out later.
Strong influence. I mean, those stories had a very strong influence, and going to the Catholic Church had a strong influence.
Yeah, we're still feeling it in cinema today. You know, I'm sorry, but just going back to the Latino aspect, I think when you have the Catholic Church in such a position of power, it's a little bit different too. You know, like it's kind of going. It's a backlash against whatever is repressing, it's that it's Catholic, it's that it's repressive.
Yes. And that it's this establishment figure that you are rebelling specifically against. But I do think that a number of these recent films, especially like the ones in the filmmakers in Mexican Barbaro, you do feel this sense of rebellion, and the Catholic Church is there, if not in exact form, as a presence of some kind. And I think it colors those films. And I think if you took those filmmakers out of Mexico, or they had not grown up in Mexico, they'd be making very different films, and maybe films that aren't quite as interesting on a certain level.
Yeah, I agree.
So if you had a handful of films to recommend to people as kind of the best way to get a nice flavor of kind of un mundo extraño style. Okay. Not necessarily the films that you're showing this year, because I'm hoping people are just going to go see these, but kind of a nice little sample of what kind of films might get you interested in this. What are a few films that you might recommend to people? Okay. It's like, these are the standards you need.
Well, I definitely would recommend everybody come see the ones that we were showing, as you said. But let's see. If I want to go more recent, popping in my head right now, there's a film from Spain that you could see on Shudder, which is a streaming service, a really good one, called Sleep Tight.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, by the director of Wreck, which it's a, what she described as a Hitchcockian thriller, which isn't far from the mark, but it's a very tense and very
disturbing.
It's disturbing, and it's also really suspenseful.
Yes,
and it's great because the suspense is because you are following along with the protagonist, who's a terrible human being and doing terrible things. But the filmmaker gets you kind of in his corner and you feel dirty by the end. Like, oh my gosh, I've been following along with this guy the whole time. That is a perfect. I think that film's so good. That is something I would absolutely show, and I would show it at either of my festivals because it's a lot of fun. Other films, on the spot now. Oh, well, I mean, I feel like a lot of the films that we've been talking about are the list of films, but to make things easier, like if you're going to want to go for something more bizarre, if you look for example, Alejandro Jodorowsky, I would probably start with Santa Sangre, which is a much more accessible film from his milieu. But if you want to go for something a little bit more challenging, he has a film called The Holy Mountain, which is very surreal but absolutely nails every point that we've been making so far over the course of this discussion.
Nothing in your education or experience can have prepared you for this film. Alejandro Jodorowsky's The Holy Mountain. The entire tradition of motion picture art.
Alucarda is a not to be missed film because it has all of these kind of points that we've been making, but it's also really entertaining with lots of nudity. So it hits that point too. I don't know if I should say that on this podcast, but from I was talking about that era of mexploitation or Mexican exploitation films in the 80s. The film Intrépidos Punks is a lot of fun. There's a film called Masacre Nocturna or Nighttime Massacre, I believe. It's an anthology movie, very cheap Mexican anthology movie. But it's a lot of fun. It's got a vampire story, and it's got like a Phantom of the Opera type story, and it's got a Bigfoot story. So if you can find that, it's a lot of fun. Anything from El Santo, but I'm going to particularly point to El Santo y Blue Demon contra los monstruos, or Santo and Blue Demon fight the monsters, or anything with vampires and werewolves. Going back to Spain, I would recommend anything from Paul Naschy's Werewolf, Valdemar Daninsky group of movies. He makes a really great werewolf, but one that hit big in the States is called The Werewolf versus the Vampire Woman, which is a lot of fun. Jesus Franco films. He's a Spanish filmmaker from the 70s, made erotic, shall we say, nightmares. These films are like hallucinations and worth a watch. He also made, on that point, his own Dracula movie starring none other than Christopher Lee as Dracula in his Spanish version of Dracula too. Ship of Monsters, you should go see. El Vampiro, the Germán Robles films. Germán Robles was also in a film called El Barón del Terror, which is known here by The Brainiac, where Robles plays a 16th century inquisitor for the Catholic Church. Who
funny how that keeps popping up.
Who ends up? Oh no, actually, he's tortured by the Catholic Church,
yes,
only to come back in the future
to get revenge on
the descendants.
Descendants, yes.
Yeah, and but he comes back as this demon with a forked tongue that eats their brains. So all of these, I mean, gosh, I could go on.
I know,
and on
there's
and
a
on.
lot. But just, I mean, I think it's good to give people some very specific titles that they might.
We should have a list on your podcast page.
We can put a list up.
Sweet.
Yes,
I'm
put
excited.
a list up. Well, we could go on talking about these films forever, but we won't. So I want to thank you, Miguel, and remind people when your Horrible Imaginings Film Festival is and where they can find you for your podcast also.
Okay, well, you can find both at hifilmfest.com. So the podcast episodes are on the homepage there. That's HI, as in Horrible Imaginings, filmfest.com, or hifilmfest.com. There you'll also find links to films that we're showing, since I work with the Film Geeks to bring other films. So you'll find trailers for other films that are coming to San Diego throughout the year. The main film festival will be September 7th through 11th. So we're ushering in the season of fear. And if any of you out there are filmmakers, we are currently accepting submissions. And you could submit on Film Freeway. But yeah, for right now, Un Mundo Extraño starts this week at San Diego Latino Film Festival, and I'm really excited about those.
Yes, and for full disclosure, Miguel and I are partners in crime on the Film Geeks at the Digital Gym Cinema, where we are volunteer programmers. Currently, we have our Get Hammered series, which is going to have Curse of the Werewolf at the close of the Latino Film Festival on March 20th.
Day.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and that brings up, like the earlier films we mentioned, this notion of looking at Latin culture from the outside. So we have a British Hammer film depicting Oliver Reed as a Spanish baron, I think he is. A Spanish baron who is also a werewolf. But this is one of those imagined parts of Europe that never actually existed.
Yeah, it takes place in Spain with quotes around it for sure. But Curse of the Werewolf is a lot of fun. It's also extremely dark. Like the origin of Oliver Reed's werewolf in this movie, it would be challenging to get it made today. Like I think at the time we were naive enough to go along with it. And I don't know if I want to even say it now, but it's like, wow, that's really dark. Should I say it?
You can say it.
All right. Yeah. So Oliver Reed is a werewolf because he's a rape baby whose mother was raped in a Spanish prison by a crazy old, potentially werewolf man. And so it's like, wow, that's a pretty intense way to start your Hammer werewolf movie. But it's got that Hammer flair, but it's definitely stand out from all the others. Both in tone and style, because largely it was supposed to take place in Spain, so it doesn't feel quite so stuffily British as the rest of them.
Well, and you do have Oliver Reed also.
You do have Oliver Reed.
He's not quite stuffily British.
No,
on any level.
He's the opposite of stuffy. He's bombastic.
Well, let's actually go out with the trailer for Curse of the Werewolf.
Ooh.
The Curse of the Werewolf. That was laid on a baby who grew into a man possessed by a monster. To this Spanish town, the night brought drinking and dancing, music and girls, and the moon. The full moon that turned an innocent man into a savage beast. The Curse of the Werewolf. A man possessed by a desperate need for love, who found in Christina all the passionate sincerity of youth.
Christina, do you love me? Will you marry me, Christina? You say you love me, will you marry me?
Yes. Yes, I will.
That was the trailer for Hammer Films' Curse of the Werewolf, which will be screening as part of both the Latino Film Festival and the Film Geeks at the Digital Gym Cinema on March 20th at 1 p.m. That's a Sunday. Thanks for listening to another edition of the KPBS Cinema Junkie podcast. You can also find my full interview with San Diego Latino Film Festival programmer Moises Esparza on the Midday Edition podcast. And I'll have another podcast from the San Diego Latino Film Festival coming up next week, talking with some filmmakers and maybe pulling a few things out from the archive. Remember, you can subscribe to the Cinema Junkie podcast on iTunes, where I hope you'll leave a rating or a comment. And you can also find it at kpbs.org/junkie podcast. So till our next Film Fix, I'm Beth Accomando, your resident Cinema Junkie.
KPBS On Demand is supported by UC San Diego's Art Power, presenting cellist Joshua Roman, performing from his album Immunity, alongside music by J.S. Bach and more, Sunday, June 22nd at UC San Diego's Epstein Family Amphitheater. Reserve your tickets at artpower.ucsd.edu.